James Beddome, leader of the Green Party of Manitoba. This is our second Green Party webinar on gardening. Last time we talked about indoor winter gardening in February. Well, now it's June, so it's time to talk about outdoor summer gardening. So I propose to take you on a little bit of a tour of my outdoor summer garden, or maybe more accurately, I should say gardens, because I have both a front yard garden, but I also share in a community garden plot with two other families. So there's some pictures of the community garden plot over the years. Working together with people helps to share the load. You have other people that you can learn from, and it's just a lot of fun creating that sense of community. You can see some of the volunteer tomatoes from my compost that we put into the community garden this year. And there's some of the potatoes in the community garden. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time on the community garden, more on the front yard garden, but it is an important part about what I do gardening, and I would encourage others to also consider community gardening. Do keep in mind that you should respect community garden plots and only go in if you are invited to by a gardener. And here's a look at the front yard garden. So we've been working at turning the front yard into a garden. Sadly, we don't have great tree coverage. We clearly lost some trees before we moved in, and it is a south face, but that means it's a great opportunity to garden. Well, I'm really hoping we can encourage people to ditch the mowed lawn. Why do you want your lawn looking like a golf course when you can have a garden instead? There's many reasons to do it. It's friendly for pollinators, creates natural habitat, but for me, I'm lazy. That's our mower. Not only are we pesticide free in our yard work, but we're also fossil fuel free, do everything manually. But if you're going to push a push mower, it never hurts to have less to push, so that we only need to worry about the boulevards and a few areas like that. I did spend this spring pretty much digging out all of the grass. It is quack grass, so the roots go down and under and deep, and if you cut them up, it just makes another blade of grass. So that's what we did this year. It did mean I had to disturb the soil, and I did shake out the roots the best I could to leave the soil intact, and did take that down to the Sustainable South Osborne compost pile where we garden, and then laid down some cardboard from cardboard boxes as a weed dampener, with wood chips also from Sustainable South Osborne on top for the paths in between as a mulch and a covering. So you're also going to want to use yard waste and clippings as mulch. So don't throw your leaves away. Don't throw your branches away. Don't throw your lawn clippings if you have any away. They make great mulch cover for your gardens. And hey, if your neighbors are throwing them away, you can probably borrow them. And they won't mind. They'll be happy to give them to you. It's such a waste for us to continuously haul away all of this organic matter when it makes a great cover. So as you can see, leaves are great, but you can also use what we commonly call weeds, but I prefer to call unwanted plants, because every plant has its place. You can just pick them. It's best if you put them in a bucket and let them dry out a little bit first before turning them to mulch. But ultimately, you can kind of spread them out around your plants, and they'll dry out in due course in the sun and will become mulch in their own way. In time, of course. When you are mulching, you're not putting it directly over the plants that you want, but you're sort of putting it around it and allowing a place for the plant to come through. It helps to both hold down moisture, give ground cover. It also helps to suppress other unwanted plants that might want to be coming up to compete with your desired plant. But what is desired or what isn't desired? In this case, in between that corn was dill weed. Well, I don't think of dill as a weed, because I think dill is delicious. And so here I am pulling out a few more of those unwanted plants. That's always one thing when you're gardening. There's lots of unwanted plants, but keep in mind, that's just a good sign of healthy soil. Healthy soil also requires compost, of course. Once again, you want to be thinking about the nutrients in the sense that you don't want to throw anything away. You want to keep all of your kitchen scraps, and you want to make sure that none of those nutrients leave, and instead you're recycling them right there locally in situ, and that's going to help have you have a healthy garden or yard. And it also helps reduce greenhouse gas emissions. So why wouldn't we be doing it, and why don't we do more of it? So this year I'm also experimenting with hugokultur, which literally means hill culture in German. And basically you're creating a raised bed by piling up old wood and branches. We cut down a maple tree that was growing into the cherry. And so I've used the branches to create a bit of a trellis, and then I filled it in with compost that wasn't really finished and old cardboard boxes that were worn down and ripped up and shredded up. Kind of any kind of organic woody matter, and you cover it with soil, and basically you let that break down, and that's going to feed the pile, and that's going to get smaller over time. And so for this year, it's my melon and cucumber and spaghetti squash hill. And looking at it yesterday, it's filled up most of that trellis. I might have to build a bigger one. But yeah, it looks like it's going to look pretty good. And it's one of the ideas of trying to keep as much of that organic matter around so you can use it after a few years. I can probably put some tomatoes or potatoes and rotate it out of a squash hill. And probably I've overseeded it. I always struggled a little bit with that. Probably I could have thinned it, and I didn't get around to it, and they've kind of gotten big. So I'm just going to let it go messy and wild, as tends to be my usual way, to be honest. I do think people should take a look at planting perennial plants. It's one of my favorite things to do. You plant it once and establish the plant over a number of years, and it keeps coming back. So fruit trees are a natural. We've got a sour cherry tree. Just every year gives us a ton of sour cherries, and really great for the pollinators as well. This year we put in a blackberry where we cleared out the maple tree, and also an apple tree that's hopefully going to provide a little bit more shade. As I said, we've got a lot of sun, and a little bit more shade on the house won't hurt. So in 10 years, this should be a beautiful apple tree, giving us both shade and some nice, juicy, delicious apples. You can grow other fruit trees in Manitoba too. There are varieties of plums, variety of pears that you can grow. Keep in mind you do want to have at least 2 trees so they can pollinate each other. We were lucky enough that our neighbor had a apple tree close by, and Sustainable South Osborne also has a lot of apple trees and cherry trees going, so the bees can fly a distance to pollinate if need be. Rhubarb is another absolutely great perennial to plant. I rescued that little tiny rhubarb plant from our backyard. It had been neglected, and I put it in the front, and it's coming. And in due time, a few more years, it'll be a big, huge rhubarb plant, but we've still got a couple small harvests this season already. And so that's great. I love rhubarb. It's one of those early things that comes up in the spring, and it's really fresh. We also have grapes that vine up the side of our house. So they trellis up the side of the house. And so they usually give us a few grapes in the fall. So that's nice for making jam or making some homemade wine. And then another great perennial is strawberries. They can spread out on their own as runners, so that's a great thing about strawberries. I got my strawberries companion planted with my asparagus. Do keep in mind there are different types of strawberries. I've actually intermingled all 3. The most popular are Juneberry. They're going to give you the biggest fruits, but they're only going to produce 1 harvest a year, usually in June, hence the name, sometimes July here in Manitoba, depending on the weather. But there also are day neutral strawberries. I really like day neutral strawberries, and I actually have quite a few day neutral strawberries in there, as well as some June bearing and as well as some ever bearing. Day neutral will produce fruit if the temperature is right. So in the fall, they're producing fruit as well, which I like to sort of have a smaller harvest spread more out over the year. And then there's also ever bearing. They don't tend to spread out as runners. So if you want to keep them more contained in your garden, or you want to grow them in a container, ever bearing may be more appropriate. So keep in mind there are different types of strawberries, and give that some thought when you're deciding what type of strawberries to plant. Strawberries also are great for an indoor garden, FYI. And then with my strawberries, as I already mentioned, I companion plant my asparagus. Asparagus has deep roots, strawberries shallower roots, so they work together. Part of a Ruth Stout method, if you've ever heard of her, I recommend that. So I really like growing asparagus. It's actually a fern, and you're harvesting the immature ferns in the spring. I got mine. They're hybrid, male only asparagus stems from St. Leon's Market. So I planted my first plant 4 years ago. And after 2 years starting to get the little harvest, I liked it so much I went and got 6 more to plant in the yard, along with some more strawberries. And over time, these plants will establish themselves and they'll produce more and more. You get your first harvest of the year really early. I got my first harvest this year at May 12th, and you get about a month to 6 weeks of harvesting. As you can see there in the video, you just got to get a knife as down to the ground below the soil if you can, and just kind of cut them off at the stalks, leave a couple of the shorter ones that are coming, and almost every day you're going to be getting new asparagus. It's a little bit of a balancing act as you get them established, of not wanting to over trim them for too many weeks, and allowing them to go up to ferns, as you'll see at the end there, and establish themselves and make their roots digger and put out more ferns, so there'll be more asparagus the next year. I probably could have, on my oldest asparagus plant, kept harvesting it past June 10th when I turned off all of the other asparagus, maybe to the end of June. But this year I just did about a month of harvesting, and maybe next year I'll do a little bit more. But I'm really enjoying growing asparagus, and I would definitely recommend it to people. I would say maybe start with a hybrid variety. That means that it's not going to breed or seed out on its own, and it's going to give you the male stalks that are most desirable to eat. Although I would really like to start playing around with heritage or heirloom asparagus, which is self-seeding. So if anyone has any experience in that, I'd love to hear from you. Another thing you want your garden to do is to actually create habitat. So you can see the bees love the asparagus, maybe even more than I do. They were certainly out there yesterday, just pollinating on that asparagus. And of course, if not that, then they're at the lilac bush or the cherry tree or the strawberry. So, this helps the pollinators, but it also helps your plants because, of course, pollinators help your plants grow and help your plants pollinate themselves to reproduce. And of course, you also need worms. If you're digging your shovel and what you're finding is worms like that, that is a good sign. That means you have healthy soil. Once again, you create a habitat for the worms help you out. They break down the organic matter, they poop it out and make it more bioavailable with lots of good little extras and nutrients for the soil and for the plants. And you got this symbiotic relationship, and that brings the birds, because in the open soil, even if you mulch, they see the worms and they see the seeds. And when the birds are out, well, then the cats are watching the birds. But fear not, no birds were harmed in the filming of this video. Our cat Harry is an inside cat, so he just gets to observe, and he quite likes it. So you always got to be thinking about, how am I going to winter garden in the summer, and how am I going to summer garden in the summer, what am I establishing for my winter garden, and in the winter, what am I establishing for my summer garden? So you can see there is a celery plant that I started in January 31st with grocery end cuttings and highlighted in the indoor gardening seminar. And now on June 25th, it's quite established, and I've been taking a few trimmings of celery from time to time. Not a lot, but just a little bit for a stir fry or something like that. So certainly you can use leftovers, get plants established, and when you get them established, you can have them for a long time. That mint that you can also see, I've had around for 3 years. And I now have a jalapeno plant that I dug up after planting last year, put in a pot. The aphids in the indoor garden really took a beating to it, so I trimmed it down and have got it to regrow again in a pot outdoors. So there you go. And outdoors is great because, as much as you do in indoor gardening, you create that natural ecosystem. So now you've got ladybugs and other natural pests feeding on the aphids. Now, of course, if you remember my winter gardening webinar, you will know I'm on a quest for never-ending fresh tomatoes. I try to keep the tomatoes going year-round. Here you can see I took out some of my tomato plants on May the 1st. The idea being to harden them up a bit, take off a few tomatoes off of them. Fear not, I did have more tomatoes inside. But my plan was to try to really push and see if I could push and get some earlier tomatoes out of the season. And I'll let myself from the past on May the 1st explain what my thinking was. So it's May 1st here, 2021. I thought pretty warm outside. Get a little bit of a spit and rain, but it's well over 20 degrees Celsius here in Winnipeg and May 1st, which isn't always ordinary. We sometimes even get a little bit of snow in early May in the odd year. But I thought it'd be a good time to take my indoor tomato plants from my winter garden outside to harden up a little bit. So I'll show you that here. So I still gotta go water these guys, but you can see hopefully that'll make these things finally come red, because they're coming, but they're not quite there. And I got more over here, and more over here. What I'm hoping to try this year, and we'll see how it works out, is harden them up a little bit inside and outside, so I'm gonna have to stake them up, and then plant them in early June, hopefully get an earlier tomato crop that way. And so ultimately I did get it planted actually on May the 18th, not June the 1st. And I think it would have been better if I had held off till June the 1st, but I just really wanted to clear up the sunroom and get them in the ground, but it was a little bit cold. It was planted much the same as you'd plant an ordinary tomato. You just dig a hole, put some coconut coir and some compost and other nutrients, maybe some calcium, broken eggshells, and potted, a little bit to slip it out, but I slid it in there. You did have to trim off any green fruits that were on the larger plants and also trim them back a little bit as appropriate, particularly more so with the cherry tomatoes. We let those ripen up, so those were our fresh tomatoes. They weren't truly fresh off the vine, but they filled the gap for the next little bit. And looking right now on June the 25th, 2021, or yesterday, we do have some pretty big fruits coming out. They're still not red as I'd like. I would have liked them earlier, but maybe I'm just being too impatient. They certainly are coming along, both this variety, it's tough to say because it's a volunteer tomatoes, I'm not sure of the variety, as well as the other variety here, which I think looks to me like it's Cherokee purple tomatoes. Obviously my volunteer tomatoes, I'm always getting heirlooms, and so many volunteers. I think I put 60 volunteer tomato plants in and gave at least 60 away, and that's fine. Also just trying to get herbs established in pots. That's always something that I highly recommend for people. I mean, I'm going to maybe preempt my last question here, but even right now, it's not too late to go out there, buy yourself a couple herb plants from the greenhouse and put them in pots. Herbs can be expensive at the store. They add so much flavor to cooking, and you can probably bring them in the winter and keep them alive and keep that freshness going year round. So it's not too late to do that. I do, of course, plant some annuals. So we've got pepper plants both in pots to bring inside and also in the soil. I started those from seed. Corn. I found that the corn actually does really well against the edge of the house. It's kind of sandy and it's getting the heat from the house, creating a little bit of a microclimate. So I think that's where I'm going to be growing the corn most years from now on. I got some beans, and I try to trellis them up, as well as my spaghetti squash, up the lilac tree. So the lilac tree becomes a trellis. And hopefully, and this is more from the community garden, we can have a big harvest of beans like we had in 2017. Of course, I mentioned we've got cucumbers and cantaloupes and all of that coming. So there's a cucumber from July in 2018. And there's some cantaloupes from last year. Those are the seeds I used over and left over. That there I call the fence routing spaghetti squash. And I kept the seeds for that too, because I felt as a politician I really needed to have the seeds for the fence routing spaghetti squash. Basically down at the community garden, it was stuck on the fence, and so none of us could pick it off or get it off, and we waited till it got really old at the end of the season, making sure it was mature and the seeds were matured. So I broke it apart and took the seeds out and kept them for replanting, because I found those spaghetti squashes that I also get from volunteers from my compost are very prolific, and they really do well. And so I figured the seeds were worth keeping, and I figure it's pretty cheeky for a politician to have something like that. So is it too late to keep planting here at the end of the June in Manitoba? I'm going to say no. It's going to depend on what you plant. I'm going to say try to plant things that have a shorter days to maturity. Lettuce, radishes, beans would all be good options. But ultimately, don't let anything stand in the way of your harvest. Ultimately, you want to try to grow the plants that you would most like to eat, or you would most enjoy if you're growing plants for aesthetic beauty. And you also want to try to balance it, try to find something that's easy enough if you're starting out as a beginner, so you can build up your confidence and go forward and learn from there. But never be afraid to experiment. That's how learning starts, and that's how learning works. So I really thank everyone for their time, and I'd be happy to answer any questions.